Hello and welcome to Media MD, the podcast where each week we prescribe each other a piece of media that we have somehow missed. I'm Ruben Morehouse.
And I'm Elliot Diebold.
And this week we're in between our push prescription and push diagnosis episodes. So you still have one more week to catch up and watch Push before we talk about it next week with spoilers. But in the meantime, we thought we would bring another Showdown episode, similar to the one we did before, where we debate two related pieces of media and talk about which would be better to prescribe to someone who has seen neither.
Yep.
So, this time we will be showdowning the two Avatar TV series. That is Avatar The Last Airbender and Avatar Legend of Korra. Or as some people say, Avatar.
Yeah, not to be confused with James Cameron's Avatar, which is slightly different a little bit.
Yeah, we should have done, which would you recommend first? Avatar The Last Airbender movie or James Cameron's Avatar? So let's just set this up by talking about who's going to be on what sides.
Yeah.
Elliot, you're going to be debating the point that people should watch Avatar The Last Airbender first, and I'm going to be arguing that people should instead watch Avatar The Legend of Korra first.
And so I guess to give some quick context to people who may have seen neither, I mean, you know, and then at the end of this, you'll be picking which one you're going to go watch first. But they're both animated cartoons set in a...
I feel like the term animated cartoons is a bit tautological.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, it's a drawn animated cartoon set in a world where some people are born with the ability to manipulate the various elements. So, you know, like fire, earth, and all that. And it's sort of like a fantasy type world. Anyway, basically it just leads to lots of fights. And there's one person called the Avatar who can bend all four, and they're basically a sort of messiah character in the world whose job it is to keep the peace and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so both the series follow different avatars.
Yep, so Avatar The Last Airbender follows the story of Aang, who is a young avatar who kind of was frozen in ice for 100 years and comes back to a world which is very basically damaged, and his quest is to restore order to the world. And I'd say that's set in a kind of analogous to medieval times that's pretty Asian influenced.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
It's a lot of kind of feudalism with some kingdoms, stuff like that. Avatar The Legend of Korra is set, like 60 years later with the next Avatar, who is called Korra.
Yeah.
And this is set in a kind of Industrial Revolution era world. The same world, 60 years on, kind of industrialized.
Yeah, basically.
So let's talk some stats here, just to lend some evidence to whichever side might be better. So I've gone to my favorite website ever, which is graph.kevinformatics.com, which is where you can graph out the IMDb plots of ratings for various episodes. So I've taken a look at the Avatar The Last Airbender ratings. So Avatar is overall rated 9.2 out of 10. Sorry, let's just call it The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. Yeah.
Yep.
So The Last Airbender is overall rated 9.2 out of 10 on IMDb. It has 3 seasons, overall trending from around 8.2 at the start to around 9.2 at the end. The highest episode is the final episode called Sozin's Comet, and the lowest rated episode is... Well, do you want to guess the lowest rated episode, Elliot?
It's got to be... It's that one, it's like episode 10 in season 1 where they go to the Grand Canyon thing.
Yep. Season 1, episode 11, The Great Divide. Correct. So Legend of Korra's trendline is a lot more stable, whereas Avatar The Last Airbender's kind of grows.
Oh, that's interesting.
Legend of Korra starts at about 8.7 and ends at about 9. So Avatar Legend of Korra's lowest episode is Season 4, Episode 8, Remembrances, which is a bit of a clip show episode.
Ironically, I don't remember it.
Yeah, I didn't remember it either until I looked it up. And the highest rated episodes of Legend of Korra are... it's a tie, actually, between Season 2, Episode 8, Beginnings Part 2, which is the second part of this like flashback episode.
Yep.
And the finale of Season 3, which is called Venom of the Red Lotus.
Yeah.
Oh, so Legend of Korra's overall rating is 8.6 out of 10, so it's a bit lower.
Okay.
But you know what? User ratings aren't everything, I would say, Elliot.
No. Especially when we're, going to decide this based on a user poll.
Yeah, so actually, good point. We will in the show notes down below, you'll be able to decide which show you think wins the vote. And now I know a lot of Avatar fans are probably going to vote for The Last Airbender just because it is the one that kind of started it all and everyone has a lot of attachments to it. I get it, guys. Yeah. I have a lot of attachments to it too. But listen to the points we're going to put forward, because I think I can put forward a pretty compelling case that people should watch The Legend of Korra first.
Okay, interesting. We'll see how that goes.
So we'll each do 3 points, and then we'll kind of see where we land on it after that.
Yeah.
Since The Last Airbender was chronologically first, do you want to go first with your first point?
Okay, it seems like pretty arbitrary reasoning, so okay, I'm going to start with a fairly sort of straightforward one. So as you sort of talked about, The Last Airbender went for 3 seasons, The Legend of Korra went for 4, but The Last Airbender is just sort of one plot. It's got a lot of coherence and a direction. It's all one story and, various narrative elements weave in and out, but it's all leading towards this one big battle. And that sort of coherence then leads to stronger characters and just sort of better aspects in a lot of other ways. Whereas Korra jumps around a lot. So, and that was by design. I'm not criticizing it necessarily. By design, they chose to have each season more or less be a standalone plot. But to me, that decision led to particularly the characters in Korra bumping around a lot, because they sort of, not all of them fit very easily into each sort of season's plot, and so there was just a lot of jumping around and not just as much coherence and movement always forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the counterpoint, my first point here that I have, is that Legend of Korra is a more realistic story, and in the service of that realism, Korra is the central character for all of these 4 plots, just because she's the avatar and everything in the world that happens essentially kind of does revolve around her, at least all the big shit. But I think I call it a world building strength that Mako and Bolin are big characters in the first season. And then their part kind of fades away in the second and third seasons, whereas Tenzin and his siblings become more important, or maybe Asami becomes important for certain seasons over others. I think it's. I agree that Legend of Korra doesn't have the kind of character cohesiveness that the original Team Avatar has. I like to call them OTA. That the original OTA has. That's an Arrow reference for those of you who don't watch stupid shit. For those of you who don't watch stupid
For those of you with good taste.
But I think that Legend of Korra overall, and this is kind of represented by the way that the team kind of adapts and changes over time, has this interesting realism to it.
I definitely see what you're saying. There's definitely an argument that the fluctuation sort of lends itself to a more realistic sort of plot and all that. But I mean, this is also a cartoon about people who shoot fireballs and earth balls at each other. I guess it kind of comes back a bit to Korra was aimed at a more mature audience than The Last Airbender, for sure. So maybe it all sort of ties back into that a little bit.
And kind of to discuss this a bit more, to talk about the more mature versus more young-aged shows, I think one of the strengths of Korra, to me, one of the biggest strengths that it has over Avatar is this 3-season-long plot to defeat one person, the Fire Lord. Right?
Yeah.
And, Azula's in there too, and she's obviously a villain. There are other villains who come and go along the way, General Zhao, whatever. But to me, the core villain of the Fire Lord is never really that much of a character in the show.
He's very flat. He's just the generic Dark Lord bad guy figure, for sure.
Yeah, the only real characterization you get is through characters like Zuko or Azula, who have direct interactions with him. And you get this hints at who he is based on the impacts that he has had on those characters, right?
Yeah, but he never really does amount to anything more than just being very evil and power hungry. Those essentially are his only traits.
Right, but I just rewatched season 1 of Legend of Korra in preparation for this, and I think this applies to... I think what I'm about to say applies a lot to the first villain, Amon, who's a villain of season 1, but also to other villains throughout the show, which is that they actually have characters, and their plans have like substance, you know. The kind of plot of season 1 of Korra is that there's this divide between benders and non-benders, and Korra has to kind of learn that not all conflicts can just be solved through fighting, while Amon is trying to basically equalize, in his words, the divide between benders and non-benders. But then there's also this whole thing about Amon not being who he says he is, and where his power comes from, and all these kind of political interplays in Republic City where it's set, which add a lot of substance to this plot that I think the overarching plot of The Last Airbender doesn't have.
Yeah.
And it leads to Amon being a character who is fucking terrifying and despicable and, like, villainous in a way that Fire Lord Ozai isn't.
I mean, but at the same time, and I mean, this is what I really like, because I thought this might come up, there's no way I can argue that I think Korra has better villains, and particularly with someone like Amon, it's because he also has a really good point. Like, the thing is it was hard to see him entirely as a villain, because his whole concept of taking power away from benders made a lot of sense, because it was really, you know, you're being born with this insane power over people who don't have it.
Yeah. And obviously his means are not justifiable, but there's his strength comes from the actual classist problems that the world of Avatar has, right?
Exactly. And like, yeah, there's a point, whereas, yeah, Ozai was very much just, I want to control the world with fire or something. And they're like, because Korra has, in season 3, Zahir, who's just sort of an anarchist, and just wants to sort of destabilize everything. Yeah, he's potentially one of my favorite villains of anything ever. Yeah,
and even though he is a very good versus evil, clear-cut villain, he's still characterized a lot better and like impacts you a lot more than Fire Lord Ozai does.
Yeah, I agree, but sort of...
Wait, is it Ozai?
Ozai.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, definitely I would agree that Korra sort of has those more mature themes that leads it to have better villains and stuff. But I still find the constant jumping around between plot arcs and all that to detract to me from just the simplicity, I guess, of the original series. It just has that cohesion that just really makes it all come together as a good story. You know, obviously, yeah, like you said, it's not as realistic, but that's not always what you're looking for in a story.
Yeah, I feel that. And I think there is a definite stylistic difference between these two shows, which is going to undercut our argument a bit by making the ultimate point of this. If you want something that is a more season-long story, you should watch Korra. And if you want something that has a bit more, like, self-contained episodes and maybe a bit of a longer arc story rather than a short form, each season is a story, then The Last Airbender is probably for you. But even having said that, I think that when The Last Airbender came out, and for the audience that it was targeted at, it is acceptable for it to be self-contained stories and the overall plot to not really be that well defined. I think there are definitely plot threads throughout there that are very well done, like Zuko's kind of redemption and interaction with Iroh. And I think the kind of plots of each arc are quite well done. So the Water Tribe kind of heading to the Northern Water Tribe and that siege, the Earth Kingdom and the subterfuge with that, and then Zuko's kind of redemption and the final confrontation. But overall, the plot isn't cohesive, and I think that's not acceptable to a level anymore that it was when The Last Airbender came out. I think the kind of goalposts of television has shifted a bit to mean that forgetting that one aspect isn't as acceptable as it was.
Yeah, I see. I understand the argument you're making, but I disagree with your analysis that it's not that it doesn't have that. But maybe that's something we can't resolve. But this does lead me into sort of my next argument. I'm not sure if it's my turn again. I've sort of lost track.
Yeah, sure.
But I would argue that The Last Airbender has just much better characters. So, you know, you just mentioned like Zuko and Iroh. And those would be some of my go-tos along with Azula. Apart from, like, we talked about those interesting villains in Korra and maybe Korra herself, I find The Legend of Korra doesn't really have any characters that give it much substance, like the sort of supporting cast, I guess. So like Marco, you know, is ridiculously flat. Bolin has his moments, but the majority of the time he's just kind of a joke character, and you can kind of compare him to Sokka in The Last Airbender, who is the joke character, but also has a lot of other things about him. And I think, it does sort of come back to that whole coherence and direction argument. The 3 seasons just let them build these characters in a much deeper way, and especially if you're someone who characters mean a lot to you when you're watching something, I think The Last Airbender sort of has a lot more there.
I would definitely agree that the supporting characters in The Last Airbender are stronger. I think Bolin and Mako in particular are especially weak in the first season, and they do kind of grow into their characters over the course of it, but they're always behind the original Team Avatar. And that kind of even extends to like Appa and Momo being contrasted with Naga and Pabu, who are the kind of equivalents in Legend of Korra. I hadn't thought of
that.
But I think the core characters at Legend of Korra, which are Korra and Tenzin, I think are very, very strong characters. And I think Korra as an avatar is more compelling to me than Aang is, even though I could understand how someone would disagree with this, but Aang to me is a very straightforward character. He's a very simple character because I think by design, because he is a lot younger.
Yeah.
And he does have his own kind of personal troubles to deal with, basically his naivety throughout the show. But Korra to me is a more well-defined and interesting character just because she is a strong bender and she just has complete disconnection from the actual problems of trying to solve, like the actual issues that she's trying to solve. And I think that's more fascinating to me, of this person who has to learn how to be diplomatic, essentially.
Yeah, well, because she's very much a contrast to Aang. Aang comes into it sort of with the spiritual side of bending down pat, and he spends his series actually learning more of the physical side.
Yeah.
Whereas Korra from the get-go is very physically capable, but she's constantly struggling to connect properly to the more spiritual aspect of being the Avatar.
Yeah, they are basically opposites, except they're the same in one way, which is that they both are bad at being diplomatic, right?
Yeah.
Korra especially, but
it's for different reasons. I would argue Aang was sort of too trusting to be properly diplomatic. He often sort of expected too much from people, whereas Korra was just sort of impatient and didn't listen. Like, she almost had the opposite problem. She would just sort of tell people what they had to do and not really actually take their feelings into account.
Yeah. I want to point out one scene in particular, which is, there's this scene where I think it's like a lot of the early episodes in Legend of Korra are Korra finding people who are making arguments about how bending is like gives undue power to triads and to criminals and whatever.
Yeah, and
her solution is, I'm going to beat you up.
Yeah.
And it's this great thing to me because it so demonstrates the problem with Korra's character, which is that she tries to solve everything with force. And it gives such a compelling arc to her character over the series, which is she has to learn that she can't just solve things through force. And she doesn't quite learn that by the end of season 1, but that's definitely the trend that she goes in.
She bounces around a bit, and that was one of the big problems I had, is when a new season would start, it often felt like she regressed a bit, and that's something you see usually on shows, like if it's like a week-to-week sitcom, like maybe something like How I Met Your Mother or something like one of those old classic sitcoms where it was like, somebody would like learn a lesson, and then because the sort of comedy demanded it, the next week they sort of would have unlearnt it.
They'd forgotten the lesson. Yeah.
Yeah, and I found that happening a fair bit in Korra, whereas that was something I felt didn't happen in The Last Airbender.
Yeah, she does regress a bit. And I think the main... Look, let's touch on the whole Legend of Korra Season 2 thing, shall we? Season 2 is a bit of a... At least for the start of Season 2, is a bit of a misstep for Legend of Korra, which I think harms it a lot. Because she does regress at the start of season 2. She becomes more hot-headed, and you realise that she's kind of forgotten everything from the first season. And then the first few episodes of the second season are so they don't quite land, and it pulls itself together as the season progresses. But I think that is probably where this idea of Legend of Korra not being as good of a show comes from. Is this cluster of early season 2? But to me, I think that one inconsistency is forgivable in a show that is trying to do more, which I think is another reason I like Legend of Korra, is it has loftier goals for the story that it's trying to tell,
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's definitely, it is trying to say more and do more with its characters and plot.
I have one last point that I'd like to make, which is Look, on the whole, it's probably a little inconsequential, but I want to bring it up anyway, just because I think it's important.
Yeah.
The music in Legend of Korra is so amazing. Like, the music in The Last Airbender was pretty good, but the kind of jazzy Asian fusion jazz music in Legend of Korra is so incredible. And it's just like, in the first season especially, there are so many great themes of Legend of Korra where she's like, there's a chase scene and this music is like popping and jazzing around, or there's this more somber scenes, or there's the pro-bending fights and the music is kind of bringing you into this action with it. The music in Legend of Korra is great, and I think that should be a point in its favor.
Okay. I'm gonna be honest. I wrote, like, because there are some great songs in The Last Airbender that I remember, but I remember, now that you're mentioning it, I remember the jazzy stuff, but it didn't stick out to me maybe quite as much as it did to you, I guess.
Really? That's interesting.
But I think it may be fair. Like, it's a nice, unique sort of style that Korra has. With you're right, that sort of Asian, like, almost classical meets jazz type mix. Whereas The Last Airbender is sort of your classic. Well, it's a very classical, just sort of, anime style soundtrack. Really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, so I had one last point to sort of make in The Last Airbender's favour, and this one's a bit counterintuitive at first, but so bear with me. I'd actually argue that The Last Airbender has a deeper and more developed world than The Legend of Korra.
Ooh. Okay, you've said it's counterintuitive, so I'll give you some time.
I mean, because it doesn't really make sense, because Korra is the sequel and is set later, so it technically has all of The Last Airbender's world building to then add on to.
Plus more.
But
yeah.
The Last Airbender is, in The Last Airbender, they travel over the whole world and they see all these great places, and you learn about all these sort of interesting cultures that are based to varying degrees on different, like, Eastern cultures in our world. Whereas Korra is very much, the Legend of Korra is very much stuck, mostly in Republic City. It branches out every now and then. There's little bits in the southern pole, and it does. I think goes to the spirit world more, but like I don't think they ever go to the Fire Nation.
No.
And it's very much its world building is usually more about how the Industrial Revolution is affecting some of the places that were in The Last Airbender, whereas The Last Airbender is all about them exploring and finding these new places that are all really, well, for the most part, all really interesting.
The Last Airbender has an Industrial Revolution episode as well. Don't you remember, Elliot, the painted lady, where there's that town that's like...
I was about to say, you're not talking about that stupid one on the water in season 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that was the basis for the whole Legend of Korra.
Yeah, they were like, this episode dealt with a lot of interesting themes. Let's make that our new show.
But anyway, yeah, so that's my point. I'd actually argue that The Last Airbender presents a much more interesting and diverse world than Korra, because Korra focuses more on the way technology is shaping certain parts of the world as opposed to exploring all of it.
Yeah, I would definitely say that the world in The Last Airbender is more diverse. I mean, like, things like the Northern Water tribe to that library in the desert with the owl spirit. There's a lot of like completely diverse scenarios in The Last Airbender, and maybe Legend of Korra. Maybe this is just me defending Legend of Korra, but the Legend of Korra might be a bit of more of a statement on how globalization causes that uniqueness to drain out of the world a little bit. Let's just say maybe that it's an intentional thing, not an oversight. But yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying. Do you have any other points you'd like to make in The Last Airbender's favour?
Well, I mean, it was made first, so you should watch it first.
Look, I didn't want to bring this up, but the counterpoint to that is that Legend of Korra is a more accessible show just through the fact that it is more recent and more adult targeted.
Yeah, that's fair.
But let's not quibble too much in this episode, Elliot. Let's let the fans decide. So if you think that whichever show you think we've talked up the most, what am I trying to say here? Fuck. Whichever show you think won this showdown, you can cast your vote in the link in the show notes down below. And we'll take a look at it probably next week or in a week or two and see what we thought. If you have any comments on which show you think is better to recommend to people who haven't seen either, then you can also leave that in the discussion thread. Again, link in the show notes. And finally, if you're looking for one more link in the show notes to click, you can leave us your thoughts on Push. And if we find some good thoughts that we want to include, we'll talk about them next week.
Yep.
So, we'll see you back in a week where we finish up talking about Push, see what we thought about it. Sign off.